Professor James, Professor Angel Foster, distinguished invitees, my faculty colleagues, staff and students. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this 12th Professor Asha Atmaram Bhende Memorial Lecture organized by International Institute for Population Sciences. All of you or most of you are familiar with the contributions of Professor Asha Bhende. She was the professor of this institute for nearly 3 decades, a well-known researcher, a reproductive health expert and a prolific writer. And I'm sure the students of demography will invariably know her because of her popular book titled The Principles of Population Studies, where most of the master and graduate students learned the basics of demography from there, which was co-authored with Professor Tara Kanidkar, and which had almost 25 editions so far, indicating its popularity among the demographers and students community. Professor Bhende was an advisor to various organizations such as University Grants Commission, NACO, Family Planning Training and Research Center, and she was also a visiting faculty at the Australian National University at Canberra and East-West Center, Hawaii. She also worked as a consultant to various international organizations like International Labour Organizations, World Health Organization, UNFPA, Rockefeller Foundation, World Vision, National Association of the Blind and Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And she was also the board member of the Foundation for Research in Health Systems and National Association for the Blind. She also served as the chairperson of the Ashish Gram Rajana Trust, which manages the Indian Institute of Health Management at Pachod in Maharashtra for many years. And her book on her life, Majya Jagatmi, In My Own World Am I, was also published, depicting her experiences in various fields. She was also, apart from a well-known academic, Professor Bhende was also a theatre personality. So Professor Bhende, who was a teacher to many of us, was a unique combination of artistic talent and academic brilliance. And she is remembered with respect and affection by her colleagues and students. And Ashish Gram Rajana Trust and Institute of Health Management Pachod requested IIPS to institute this memorial lecture in their honor. And the 2011, the first Professor Asha Bhende Memorial Lecture was organized. I remember the well-known reproductive health expert Dr. Shirin Jijibai delivered the first lecture. To deliver this 12th Professor Asha Bhende Memorial Lecture, we have a very distinguished scholar, Professor Angel Foster. She is a professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences, University of Ottawa, Canada. She holds a doctorate from University of Oxford, an MD from Harvard Medical School, and master's degree from Stanford University. Dr. Foster is a global abortion researcher and leads projects in 22 countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, Middle East, and North America. She has authored more than 100 articles and co-edited 3 books. She has also led the most recent revision of the Interagency Field Manual on Reproductive Health in Humanitarian Settings. Professor Foster serves as the chair of the Board of Directors of National Abortion Federation, Canada, and co-chair of the Safe Abortion Care Interagency Working Group on Reproductive Health in Crisis. And she is also the chief editor of the journal Perspectives in Sexual and Reproductive Health. Professor Foster is the recipient of numerous awards and honors. She received the Guttmacher Institute's 2017 Darwich Award for Excellence in Sexual and Reproductive Health, and also Society for Scientific Study of Sexuality's 2018 Public Service Award. So we are very happy to have Professor Angel Foster with us today to deliver this important lecture on a very important topic. Thank you for accepting our invitation and coming here. And on behalf of all of us, I request our director to present a bouquet, shawl and memento to our guest speaker, Professor Foster. Now I request our director, Professor James, to chair this session and also for his introductory remarks. Over to Professor James.
Professor Angel Foster, Professor T.V. Shekhar, distinguished invitees, my faculty colleagues, staff and students. It's indeed a great pleasure for us to welcome Professor Angel Foster to the Institute as well as to deliver this Professor Asha Bhende Memorial Lecture on a very important topic which we all look forward, because the title itself suggests that it's an issue, a political issue, it's a larger political issue perhaps in the world. It's a gender issue, it's a human rights issue and whatnot. Perhaps abortion has been discussed at various fronts, at various levels, and I'm sure you had the discussion with our IIPS team, which had also created a knowledge base on abortion in India, which has also led to perhaps more controversies than resolution of issues, because abortion is such a subject which we can really have a meaningful resolution, because that is why it is important to have constant research, constant scientific inquiry, constant investigation on how actually this difficult issue can be settled. I know perhaps it is also incidental that Professor Asha Bhende, we always believe that not only she is an exceedingly well-known scholar, but she is also perhaps, we can say, a community scientist or perhaps a program scientist, which is a rare combination which we see among academics, because we are all comfortable in our limits to teach and do research, but she has really taken research to the community. That was perhaps one of her biggest contributions. I see Professor Angel is also one among the very big practitioners. Not only that she has carried out research in various 22 or over 22 countries, but she is also actively enrolled in the abortion, providing the facilities to the large number of women, and also perhaps on advocating, maybe more of an activist, which all those levels we can say Professor Foster is enrolled. I'm sure she will narrate some of this experience to us during her talk today. So let me also welcome you once again and thank you for agreeing to come. I know this is a vexed topic, so naturally we also need time to listen to you, to grasp you, to understand it, because it's difficult for anyone really. It's a complex issue. So we look forward to your talk, and after that we will have some discussion and question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction and for the beautiful gifts. This is really amazing. It's my honor to be here. Thank you both so much for your remarks. I also am especially grateful to my fabulous PhD student, Dipesh Savarna, who's here in the front row, and I wanted to say how proud I am of the work that you're doing here. My name is Angel, my pronouns are she, her, hers, or anything respectful, and my institutional home is the University of Ottawa, and I want to acknowledge that it stands on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. In 1988, France became the first country in the world to license the combination of mifepristone and a progestin analog to induce an early abortion. Although women all over the world had been using medicines and tinctures for centuries to bring down their periods or end a pregnancy, the creation of a medication-based regimen specifically designed to induce an abortion was nothing short of revolutionary. This disruptive technology had the potential to transform the way that abortion was conceptualized, how abortion services were structured, and how women were able to control their lives, bodies, and fates. Indeed, when Claude Évin, the then Minister of Health in France, declared in late 1988 that mifepristone was the, quote, moral property of women, unquote, the ownership of the drug was symbolically transferred from governments and companies that make the product to women and those who might use it. As mifepristone began to roll out in countries, first in other countries, first in China in 1988, then Great Britain in 1991, and then much of Western Europe in the 1990s, expectations remained high. But it was perhaps the build-up to the approval of mifepristone in the United States in 2000 that generated the most anticipation. Leading up to mifepristone's approval by the US Food and Drug Administration, claims that the introduction of medication abortion would revolutionize access abounded. Headlines declared that medication abortion would result in the normalization of abortion within health systems and primary care, that it would drive down costs and decrease stigma. The promise was extraordinary. As we will soon celebrate the 35th anniversary of mifepristone's approval, we have an opportunity to ask ourselves, has this promise been realized? On the one hand, we see that mifepristone has now been registered in more than 60 countries worldwide and has been used by more than 60 million women. In countries where mifepristone is registered, we see medication abortion replacing instrumentation services. More than 80% of all abortions in countries as diverse as China, India, Sweden, and Tunisia are now completed through the use of mifepristone and misoprostol. But on the other hand, we still see that mifepristone is not registered or available in most of the global south, a dynamic that strongly correlates with the legal status of abortion. Unsafe abortion results in 8 to 18% of pregnancy-related deaths, and nearly 7 million women each year are treated for complications from unsafe abortion worldwide. And even in countries where abortion is legally permitted for all or most reasons, we see persistent barriers to access. Both internalized and externalized stigma surrounding abortion are considerable, and in many contexts, abortion remains highly politicized. So what does that say about mifepristone's promise nearly 35 years into this extraordinary journey? This afternoon, I'll argue that it is the over-regulation of mifepristone and the over-medicalization of medication abortion that has curtailed its promise. Indeed, I assert that the sea change in abortion access brought on by medication abortion is really occurring in settings where abortion is legally restricted. The simplicity of medication abortion provides an opportunity to provide safe and effective abortion care in low-resource settings, to demedicalize the procedure, and to put abortion care, both literally and figuratively, into women's hands. In the process, mifepristone has fundamentally transformed global understandings of how abortion, understandings of abortion, and has introduced new questions about language and frames that we continue to grapple with. So this afternoon, I'm going to begin by providing a brief overview of abortion in the global context and a bit of a history about the quote-unquote abortion pill. I'll then turn to what I call the perils of over-medicalization by looking at the way that mifepristone is regulated in the United States. These non-evidence-based regulations on the drug itself have allowed for continued political interference in the practice of medicine and muted the potential of this technology to expand access to care. This stands in sharp contrast to Tunisia, a country in North Africa that approved mifepristone at roughly the same time, And the case of Tunisia highlights how in an alternative universe, medication abortion can become fully integrated into the health system. But both the US and Tunisia cases are stories about the formal health system. And I think the true disruptive potential occurs when medication abortion is used outside of the clinic setting. I'll talk briefly about two projects where medication abortion has expanded access to safe but not necessarily legal services through demedicalized strategies. The story of mifepristone in Poland highlights the work of global activists who are able to provide abortion services online. And the story of northern Thailand and Pakistan demonstrates that lay providers can offer medication abortion in the form of misoprostol alone with a high degree of safety to some of the world's most vulnerable women. These cases turn some of what we know, or what we think we've always known about abortion, on its head. So I'll conclude by talking about the ways in which medication abortion challenges orthodoxy, and what that means for the language we use and the way we think about abortion. Before opening it up to questions and discussion, I'll also share with you some of my ideas about the ways in which medication abortion can be truly revolutionary. I've been involved with medication abortion as a researcher and as an activist for over 20 years. I was actually in medical school when mifepristone was first approved in the US, and I trained on how to provide mifepristone and misoprostol back in 2002. So today I'm going to draw from original research that my group has done, as well as work that has been done by many, many others. Now, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, abortion is extremely common. About 56 million abortions occur each year, and 25 million or so occur in legally restrictive settings. That is, where abortion is prohibited for some or most reasons in the first trimester, countries that are red or yellow on the map. About 40% of women worldwide live in a country with restrictive abortion laws, and 26% live in countries in which abortion is permitted only to save the life of the woman or is prohibited under all circumstances. As you can see on this map, countries where abortion is restricted for many or most reasons are concentrated in the global south. Not coincidentally, this is where most unsafe abortion and the sequelae from unsafe abortion take place. We have known for ages that abortion is common. We've also known for decades that laws restricting abortion do not reduce the abortion rate. Rather, these laws increase the proportion of abortions that are unsafe. And we know that restrictive abortion laws and other factors that impede access to safe and legal abortion care don't impact all women equally. Poor, young, unmarried, indigenous, racial, ethnic, religious minority, rural, less educated, and refugee and displaced women are less likely to navigate barriers and are more likely to have unsafe abortions and suffer harms. So these are the dynamics that inspired a team of researchers in France to embark in the late 1970s on the development of the abortion pill. Their aim was to develop something that could expand unfettered access to very early pregnancy termination. Indeed, Dr. Étienne-Émile Beaulieu, one of the French researchers who developed mifepristone, believed that the drug had revolutionary potential to blur the line between contraception and abortion. He proposed thinking about it as an unpregnancy pill, or as a contragestive, that is, a pill that countered gestation. And by the mid-1980s, this group determined that RU486, the 38,486th compound created by researchers at the French pharmaceutical company Roussel-Uclef, that this compound was about 60% effective in ending an early pregnancy. By adding a second medication, a prostaglandin E1 analog, the efficacy increased substantially. But there were a great many challenges to bringing mifepristone to the market. After several years of clinical trials and lots of tweaking, we now know that mifepristone and misoprostol is about 98% effective when taken during the first 10 weeks after the first day of a last menstrual period. So the abortion pill is actually a 2-drug regimen that is extremely safe. There are few contraindications, side effects are tolerable and transient, and when complications arise, there's time to manage them. As a result, the World Health Organization's safe abortion guidelines support provision in low-resource settings and by a range of clinicians and health workers. Studies from around the world show that mifepristone and misoprostol are highly acceptable to both women and providers, and when mifepristone is not available, misoprostol can be used alone. As mifepristone began to roll out in Europe over the course of the 1990s, legal and regulatory impediments began to arise immediately. Mifepristone challenged long-held assumptions, often enshrined in law, about the very definition of an abortion. When, for example, does an abortion begin? When the person takes the mifepristone and swallows the pill? When the person begins bleeding? When all products of conception are expelled? Where does the abortion itself take place? In the clinic where the person gets an exam? At the site where the person swallows the first pill? Or at the place where the person begins to bleed? Existing regulations touching on everything from facility requirements to the scope of practice of various health service providers had to grapple with the introduction of early medication abortion. In general, mifepristone was over-medicalized, with cumbersome requirements that might have made sense for instrumentation services, but didn't make sense when the first part of the abortion process involved swallowing a pill. Some health systems, such as Sweden and the Netherlands, proved flexible and began to make evidence-based changes and adapted systems and regulations. The result was a shift away from instrumentation abortion toward earlier abortions with mifepristone. Other countries, such as Great Britain, which until the beginning of the pandemic required that both mifepristone and misoprostol be used in clinic, proved resistant to change. Unquestionably, these regulatory barriers, some motivated by anti-choice politics, some motivated by paternalism, some based on the power of physician groups, they reduced access to mifepristone. But the US has been a special case. As I'm sure everyone in the room is well aware, abortion is highly politicized in the United States. Abortion was legalized at the federal level in 1973, but for decades, individual US states enacted a slew of laws designed to restrict abortion access, from waiting periods to physician-only laws. By the mid-1990s, 87% of US counties, geographic areas that were home to about a third of women of reproductive age, were without an abortion provider, and violence and harassment targeting abortion-providing clinicians was on the rise. So given this context, mifepristone had extraordinary potential. Medication abortion could move abortion from freestanding clinics to the primary care setting, therefore expanding abortion access in rural areas to smaller communities, and it could protect clinicians at the same time. When mifepristone was finally approved by the FDA in 2000, reproductive health, rights, and justice clinicians, researchers, and advocates were optimistic. But it became clear soon after mifepristone's approval that many states would attempt to regulate medication abortion in exactly the same way they had regulated other abortion care. For example, requiring that those providing medication abortion have admitting privileges at a hospital, or requiring that facilities have certain types of light fixtures. Many legal battles followed. Mifepristone was never going to be a panacea, but the approval of mifepristone was also accompanied by regulatory barriers that have made expanding access extremely difficult. The original label for mifepristone in the US was accompanied by something called the REMS, a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. And until earlier this year, the REMS prevented mifepristone from being dispensed from pharmacies, and prescribers had to register in advance with the distributor of the drug. This over-regulation meant that mifepristone was exceptionalized. Rather than being treated like any other safe pill that is prescribed and dispensed, it instead requires clinicians and patients to navigate significant hurdles to get it. And the REMS isn't the only regulatory barrier. In recent years, anti-choice legislatures have passed what are known as label laws, laws requiring that clinicians prescribe mifepristone only as detailed on the original FDA-approved label. These laws effectively prevent clinicians from practicing evidence-based medicine. And there is now a current lawsuit that, if successful, would require the FDA to withdraw its approval of mifepristone entirely. Despite all of the regulatory craziness surrounding mifepristone in the US, as of 2020, about half of all abortions in the US were with mifepristone and misoprostol. And but for the incorporation of mifepristone into a number of primary care practices, the number of abortion providers would be declining even faster. Now, of course, I'm sure many of you are aware that last year, the US Supreme Court reversed longstanding precedent, and as a result, individual US states are now permitted to ban, restrict, or regulate abortion. In my capacity as a member of the board of directors of the National Abortion Federation, which is the professional organization of abortion providers in the US, I've been living and breathing the US abortion nightmare for this last year. And during our discussion, I'm happy to address any questions that you might have more generally about what's happening in the US context. But I think it's important to realize that these restrictions on mifepristone that I've been discussing were all in effect prior to this Supreme Court decision and the drama that has since unfolded. The US is extreme, but overregulation of mifepristone worldwide is the norm, not the exception. However, we do have some examples of where mifepristone has become fully integrated into existing health systems. Sweden, the Netherlands, and France are all interesting examples. But I want to showcase the journey of mifepristone in Tunisia, both because it's a country that I've been doing work in for more than 25 years, and also because it's a story that I suspect people are less familiar with. Tunisia gained independence from France in 1956, and the government immediately embarked on a series of bold legal reforms, including the reformation and secularization of personal status law. The codification of women's educational and professional rights and opportunities soon followed. But there was widespread recognition that women in Tunisia would not be able to fully exercise their political, economic, or educational rights if they did not have reproductive control and autonomy. In 1962, the Tunisian government introduced the first family planning program in Africa, a program that expanded nationally by the mid-1960s. The legalization of abortion soon followed, first in a limited way in 1965, and then in 1973, the penal code was amended such that abortion became legal without restriction as to reason, marital status, or age throughout the first trimester. In an effort to minimize potential opposition, then President Habib Bourguiba included the announcement in a broader speech reaffirming the government's commitment to family planning and emphasized the compatibility of the reformed abortion law with Islamic principles. In September of 1973, President Bourguiba announced the liberalization of the abortion law on the steps of the holiest mosque in Tunisia on the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, surrounded by Islamic jurists. And to demonstrate the government's continued prioritization of family planning, that same year the Tunisian government created the National Office of Family Planning, or the ONFP, an autonomous ministry, a subdivision of the Ministry of Public Health. Tunisia's first woman physician, Dr. Tawhida Ben Sheikh, a vocal proponent of legal abortion and herself a provider, was appointed the first director of the ONFP, which to this day is a cabinet-level position. So in the same 50-year period that the battles have raged in the US, abortion has not really been a political issue in Tunisia. Indeed, abortion is generally viewed as a medical and public health issue, as an integral part of the women's health program, and in turn as a vital component to overall economic and human capacity development. Tunisia continues to have the safest and most comprehensive abortion service in the Middle East and North Africa, and is a model for global South countries around the world. Abortion care is also largely provided by midwives, and unsafe abortion is virtually non-existent. And in 2001, Tunisia introduced medication abortion into the National Women's Health Program. Tunisia's introduction of mifepristone followed participation in several years of multi-center clinical trials supported by the WHO and the Population Council. And in the process of doing those trials, clinicians throughout the ONFP network were trained in medication abortion provision and became champions of the approval. So when mifepristone was approved for use in general, not just for clinical trials in 2001, it was quickly integrated into service delivery. By 2010, over 80% of all abortions in the country were with mifepristone and took place within the first 9 weeks of pregnancy. As new evidence emerged about best practices, Tunisia's clinical guidelines and standards of care followed suit. The Tunisia example shows that mifepristone can be fully integrated into an existing health system. And mifepristone does not need to be encumbered by exceptional regulatory requirements. It can be offered by appropriately trained clinicians through existing health facilities with normal drug distribution. And if services were fully integrated, then when the political winds change, or for example, in Tunisia, when there was a revolution and a conservative Islamic government came to power, abortion care can continue unabated. So far, I probably haven't convinced you that mifepristone is especially disruptive. Yes, it's important for people to have choices about the type of abortion care they receive. Yes, medication abortion has the potential to increase the pool of providers. Yes, expanding access to abortion in general is a social and reproductive justice issue. But when we look at settings where abortion is broadly legal, this is maybe a bit on the margins, important but not revolutionary. However, in the reproductive health and rights community, the standard tone has long been that liberalization of abortion laws is a necessary but insufficient condition for eliminating unsafe abortion. But after decades of research and advocacy, women are still dying and suffering from unsafe abortion. Governments are often unresponsive to the evidence. Major funders, including multilateral, bilateral, and private foundation donors that work in the maternal health or reproductive health space often won't touch abortion. So is policy change necessary to change the dynamics of unsafe abortion at all? And when we explore some of the demedicalized models of medication abortion, particularly those in legally restricted settings, this is where the potential really blossoms. So let's take the case of Poland. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Poland has one of the most restrictive abortion laws in Europe. Despite Poland's history as an abortion trailblazer, in 1993, abortion was restricted to a set of very narrow cases. Recent legal changes have further limited the grounds for which an abortion can be legally obtained. So as a result, there are about 700 to 900 abortions that are performed officially each year in Poland for a population of 38 million. To give you a sort of comparison point, Canada has a slightly smaller population, and there are about 100,000 abortions each year. Tens of thousands of Polish women obtain clandestine abortions annually through private sector clinics, abortion tourism, and travel to other countries, and more recently, online telemedicine services. So since 2014, Women Help Women has operated a medication abortion telemedicine service in Poland. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I'll just say that Women Help Women was legally incorporated in my office in Ottawa. But how does this service work? Polish women seeking an abortion find the website and complete a 35-item online questionnaire. Eligible women, as determined by self-report, receive a mailed package of mifepristone and misoprostol. Women are asked to complete a follow-up questionnaire after using the medications, and online counselors are available to respond to questions. We examined the logs that Women Help Women collected over an 18-month period. To understand women's perspectives on the telemedicine service, we also conducted in-depth interviews with 20 Polish women who had obtained abortion care through Women Help Women. So what did we find? Over the 18-month study period, nearly 1,100 Polish women completed the initial online consultation. Now, less than 1 in 5 completed the follow-up questionnaire, but of those that did, about 99% confirmed that their abortion was successful. For these women, side effects were tolerable, and most women felt relieved. Participants in our qualitative study were overwhelmingly satisfied with the abortion care they received. In addition to being grateful for obtaining the abortions they desired, women valued the privacy, confidentiality, and convenience that the online service conferred. Although some participants had incomplete knowledge of the abortion restrictions in Poland at the time, all understood that their own abortions did not fall within the legal exceptions. And women had a variety of suggestions as to how information about and access to safe abortion care could be improved, but all felt strongly that the telemedicine service should continue and be expanded, and they would use an online provider again, even if alternatives were available. So our findings suggest that Women Help Women is actually a major provider of abortion care for Polish women. Indeed, during the 18-month study period, Women Help Women provided about as many abortions as those that were officially recorded in all of Poland. Although follow-up rates are low, and this is a major limitation that we see in all telemedicine studies around abortion, The outcomes are reassuring and consistent with other studies of web-based abortion service delivery. The findings suggest that demedicalized online provision of mifepristone and misoprostol is an acceptable and effective strategy for expanding access to safe abortion services. Now, the development of telemedicine services that provide mifepristone and misoprostol through the mail is expanding the global availability of safe abortion medications. But there are limitations. What if you can't receive mail? What if you aren't able to complete the online form? What if you can't afford a donation to get the mail sent to you, the pills sent to you? Here is where misoprostol alone comes into play. So misoprostol is a prostaglandin analog that was originally created to prevent NSAID, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug-induced gastric ulcers, and was subsequently registered around the world. Misoprostol is now rarely used for that original indication. Commonly known by its brand name of Cytotec, misoprostol causes uterine contractions and cervical softening, and thus throughout the world it is used primarily in obstetrics and gynecology, to induce labor, to prime the cervix before surgery, and to treat intrauterine fetal demise. Indeed, in most countries, misoprostol is used off-label, as the medication remains registered solely for ulcer prevention. Throughout the 1980s, misoprostol made its way into health systems across the globe and is currently registered in over 100 countries. And in many countries, misoprostol became available in community pharmacies. Now, the label for misoprostol warns that misoprostol should not be used in pregnancy because it can cause an abortion. Women are resourceful and resilient, and women around the world learned about the medication and began using misoprostol for pregnancy termination. Indeed, women in Brazil, a country where abortion has long been severely legally restricted and unsafe abortion is common, women in Brazil began using misoprostol to end their pregnancies. In addition to becoming unpregnant, women substituted misoprostol for other unsafe practices like sharp stick insertion or pummel massage, and as a result, there was a population-level reduction in maternal mortality. In response, the Brazilian government upregulated misoprostol, making it more difficult to obtain. But the experience of women in Brazil prompted researchers to turn their focus to the other abortion drug. It turns out that misoprostol is actually pretty good as a solo abortifacient when the optimal regimen is used. And the WHO has long cited misoprostol alone as 75 to 85% effective in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. However, without standardized information and instructions, women utilize misoprostol in numerous ways with a high degree of variation in both dosage and timing. And some of these regimens are not as effective as others. So given this context, a number of efforts have been undertaken in the last decade to increase access to safe and legal abortion care and reduce harm from unsafe abortion, particularly through the use of misoprostol alone. And one of these demedicalized strategies involves community-based distribution. In the early 2010s, abortion was legally permissible in Thailand for a number of reasons. However, the more than 1.5 million refugees and undocumented migrants from Myanmar living in northern Thailand faced structural barriers to accessing safe abortion care, even if they met the eligibility requirements. Thus, consistent with what we see in many humanitarian and displacement settings around the world, refugees and migrants from Myanmar were at a heightened risk of having and dying from unsafe abortion. It was this context that prompted a group of organizations in northern Thailand and North America to launch an initiative dedicated to the community-based distribution of misoprostol for early abortion along the Thailand-Myanmar border. At the time, mifepristone was not approved for use in Thailand, but misoprostol was widely available. Our initiative involved the establishment of 2 networks to provide refugees and undocumented migrants living in the border region and seeking an abortion with information about misoprostol and quality verified product. The way the program works is that a woman with a self-reported unwanted pregnancy of 9 weeks or less contacts a trained network provider, and these lay providers include social workers and community health workers. The woman then receives in-person counseling regarding pregnancy options, the legal status of abortion in Thailand and Myanmar, use of misoprostol, expected symptoms, conditions warranting clinic or hospital follow-up, and the process by which to report the outcome. She's then given the misoprostol tablets with instructions for use. And finally, following follow-up within 1 month is initiated by either the woman or the network provider. Evaluation of the outcomes of the program showed that this strategy was both successful and acceptable to lay providers and those who sought abortion care. Indeed, in a 3-year period from 2011 to 2014, over 900 refugees and undocumented migrants from Myanmar obtained abortion through this initiative, and over 96% were not pregnant at follow-up. There were no adverse events warranting hospitalization that were reported, and we only lost 4 participants to follow-up. The success of this initiative gave us confidence that this type of approach could be replicated. And so in 2019, our North American research team partnered with a local NGO to establish a similar program in Sindh, Pakistan. So in Pakistan, most of the more than 2 million induced abortions that occur each year are defined as unsafe, and unsafe abortion is a major contributor to maternal death and disability. The legal permissibility of abortion in Pakistan depends on gestational age, and prior to the formation of fetal organs or limbs, abortion is legally permissible to save the life of the woman or to provide, quote, necessary treatment, unquote. Both necessary treatment and fetal development markers can be variably interpreted, which creates some gray area as to the legal permissibility of abortion, especially in the first trimester of pregnancy. However, high-quality clinic-based abortion care is largely unavailable outside of major urban areas, and mifepristone is not registered or available. Misoprostol, however, is widely available in Pakistan. So for this initiative, we trained 12 lay providers in 2 rural districts of southeastern Pakistan to offer misoprostol for early abortion. These women had already been identified in their communities as trusted lay providers of healthcare. The way the program works is that a woman with a self-reported unwanted pregnancy of 10 weeks or less contacts a provider. The lay provider then offers in-person counseling regarding the legal status of abortion, pregnancy options, the use of misoprostol and the expected abortion process, and also reviews conditions warranting immediate follow-up. Lay providers then administer the first 800 microgram misoprostol dose sublingually and give the women 2 additional doses to take at home. And the lay providers ask women to call or return to the center within 2 weeks or if they have questions or problems. Lay providers follow up with women after 4 weeks if they've not heard from them about the outcome. So we evaluated the outcome of 120 consecutive cases beginning in late 2019, and at 4 weeks after the initiation of the misoprostol regimen, none of the women were pregnant. Lay providers reported that 7 women were still likely pregnant at initial follow-up, at which time they received an additional dose of misoprostol, and none of the women who received misoprostol through the community distribution program experienced complications warranting medical intervention. Women reported a range of side effects that were expected and transient, and interviews with both lay providers and those who obtained abortion care through the program reveal that there's tremendous enthusiasm for the initiative and a real appetite for scaling it up. So the outcomes from the initiative in Pakistan are reassuring and align with those from the program in northern Thailand. And taken together, these evaluations suggest that the community-based distribution of misoprostol through lay providers can be a highly successful strategy to increase access to safe abortion care in low-resource, legally restricted settings. Providing additional misoprostol and reporting outcomes at 4 weeks after initiating the abortion process likely explains the success rate associated with this initiative compared to the 75 to 85% effectiveness of misoprostol that the WHO cites. But we lost very few women to follow-up in these two interventions, and so we're confident that we didn't miss any serious adverse events. So in terms of what we're doing now, we are actually working to expand the initiative in northern Thailand and integrate the strategy with other efforts to increase access to safe abortion care. We're working with partners to scale up the initiative in Pakistan. We actually have managed to integrate community-based distribution into the global guidance on sexual and reproductive health in humanitarian settings, which was a big win. And we've now expanded this project to 2 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Uganda. And importantly, in these settings, we're really looking at how this can roll out in urban environments. Finally, I'll just say that we are looking at ways to adopt this model to expand access to abortion in the parts of the United States where abortion is now legally restricted. So the demedicalized initiatives that I've described in both Poland, in telemedicine, and then in Thailand and Pakistan through community-based distribution are taking place in very different settings. But the strategies that I've described are consistent with what we find elsewhere. Namely, demedicalized strategies are safe, effective, and acceptable, and they expand access to medication abortion. Women are able to determine for themselves if they're pregnant and do not want to be, if they're eligible for abortion based on gestational age, if they have contraindications, or if they need follow-up. And routine in-clinic pregnancy tests, ultrasounds, and clinical examinations are not necessary for medication abortion. In short, we can trust women. So moving in the direction where women have control and can decide for themselves if, when, where, how, and with whom to have a safe and effective medication abortion is revolutionary. And mifepristone, and I would argue misoprostol as well, are the technologies that allow us to do just that. That, in effect, does have the potential to change everything. Now, expanding access to online medication abortion services and developing community-based networks are all ways of circumventing restrictions, expanding access, and fostering reproductive autonomy. And they're all happening now. But as revolutionary as medication abortion has already been, it has the potential to be much more disruptive. And I think Canada can pave the way. Canada was late to the mifepristone party. After one of the longest review processes in the history of the agency, in 2015, Health Canada approved the mifepristone misoprostol regimen under the brand name mifepristone for early abortion in Canada. The initial decision included a number of non-evidence-based restrictions. The combination pack finally became available in January of 2017, and despite the limitations imposed by the product monograph, use of medication abortion soared. By the end of 2018, approximately 12% of all 100,000 abortions in Canada involved mifepristone, and providers were offering medication abortion throughout the country. It's pretty remarkable for a year after its introduction. Use of mifepristone is poised to increase even more dramatically. As a result of tremendous advocacy, media coverage, and a change in the federal government, the regulations and guidelines surrounding mifepristone have changed. And in 2020, about a third of all abortions were with mifepristone and misoprostol. Indeed, Canada's regulatory environment has leapfrogged over other countries in the global north. And that mifepristone is now classified as almost all other prescription drugs and dispensed by pharmacists has opened up a range of possibilities for exploring primary care, telemedicine, and demedicalized model of service delivery. So given this context, in 2020, my group at Ottawa, in partnership with the National Abortion Federation Canada and abortion providers in 5 provinces, launched a 5-year initiative to get mifepristone behind the counter. Our goal is to have the combination pack available directly from pharmacists in at least one province by the end of 2025. This means that a person could go into a retail pharmacy, consult with a pharmacist, and if eligible, receive mifepristone and misoprostol on the spot. No exam, no ultrasound, no blood work. Obtaining an abortion from the pharmacy after being counseled and triaged could expand access tremendously and would still keep abortion care within the formal health system, and thus the cost would continue to be covered. This type of formal regulatory change is no small feat, and we're undertaking a series of clinical trials and interventional studies to build the case for behind-the-counter status in Canada. But we're also learning from the experiences in South Asia. In Bangladesh, India, and Nepal, medication abortion technically requires a prescription. However, as much as 25% of all abortions are taking place directly through pharmacies. These abortions are, shall we say, extra legal. However, all evidence suggests that this system of delivery is safe and effective, and that medication abortion drugs are widely available. Indeed, at the end of last year, Depeche partnered with one of my postdoctoral fellows to conduct a mystery client study in Delhi. They visited 91 pharmacies in different neighborhoods and were able to purchase mifepristone and misoprostol without a prescription from pharmacies in about a quarter of their encounters. Learning more about the availability and accessibility of medication abortion drugs in South Asia, and we're just starting projects here in India and in Nepal, has the potential to improve the abortion care system in the region, but it's also part of a global abortion project And we anticipate that the findings will also have the potential to support our efforts in Canada to demedicalize medication abortion. But I think we can go further. Moving forward with behind-the-counter availability is an important step, but does that initial consultation with a pharmacist need to happen at all? If we really trust women and pregnant people, can they not make the decisions themselves after reading a label? I think it will take time, and having a solid foundation with behind-the-counter access is critical, but I believe that we will one day see medication abortion over the counter, where a person could purchase mifepristone and misoprostol without a prescription and then follow up with a clinician if needed. This is a heavy lift, but the technologies lend themselves to this type of availability. I'm also hoping that we can return to the concept of very, very early medication abortion. Imagine for a moment that over the course of your last menstrual cycle, you had sex that carried a risk of pregnancy. You decide that you don't want to be pregnant from that act or any other that took place over the last few weeks. So on the day of your expected period, you take a pill or a combination of pills from your medicine cabinet. No pregnancy test, no exam, no ultrasound. In a few days, you start to bleed. Were you pregnant? Did you have an abortion? Or was that your period, just 2 days late? This returns to Beaulieu's original concept of a liminal technology, something that blurs the lines between contraception and abortion. And whether we call it a bring down your period pill, or a contragestive, or an unpregnancy pill, this would fundamentally change the way we think about abortion. We might not even know how many abortions a person has had over the course of a year, let alone over the course of their lives. This is a frame shifting that is certainly not inevitable, but this is the potential of this technology. And I'm certainly not saying that this could happen tomorrow, but I think this is the direction we are and should be going. So with that, I want to thank you for allowing me to speak today. Much of what I've talked about is included in our upcoming book, which I co-edited with my longstanding colleague, Dr. Lisa Wynn. The book will be coming out sometime in the next year. Unfortunately, it will sadly be quite expensive, but I am very happy to give free copies to people. So if anyone is interested, all you would need to do is shoot me an email and I can make sure that you can have an electronic copy when it's available. And so with that, thank you very much, and I'll open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Angel. It has been fascinating to listen to the stories from different countries and strategies they adopt and how humans often overcome the limitations and the restrictions which is imposed on them, as well as the new hope which you have put forth on this area, actually fast developing in terms of the technology. Perhaps technology can find a solution to many of these issues later. We may not be even able to measure abortion itself, or that itself, the blurred difference between an abortion or not abortion. And demedicalization, I think that perhaps is the key word which has really brought out. It is very important to demedicalize abortion, which really gives the women the power and the empowerment which is necessary. Thank you for that exciting talk. I'm sure there will be questions and comments and suggestions. We're open for any questions, any comments, suggestions. And there is a microphone. Yeah, sure, you can just circulate it. Okay, who is going to start? Okay, please, over to Shri.
Maybe the
Students? No, I think it's flexible. Anyone can really start. We don't distinguish between students and faculty.
Thank you, that was really fascinating. I myself have done a bit of work on abortion, and so it's all the more interesting for me. I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to restrict to two, if I may. You mentioned that in Tunisia, midwives were providing abortion, MA and so on. How did that happen? Did the physician community make efforts to block this? Were there adverse consequences of midwives providing abortion? Was it always safe, effective, acceptable? We did some trials in India trying to see whether midwives and other mid-level providers could provide a MA safely, effectively, acceptably. And despite very good findings, there was no difference between them and physicians. The Indian government refused to carry it on. There was a huge backlash, personally against those of us who were part of the trial, and it's been completely squashed. So despite WHO guidelines and so on, that doesn't seem to be a way forward here. And on your other point, you said that women are increasingly able to determine for themselves if they're pregnant. This may be so, but in India it's not so for the young, the unmarried, who don't recognize that pregnancy till very much later in pregnancy. Sorry. I have more.
Great. Thank you so much for those questions. To start with the case of Tunisia and midwives, I think one of the things that is important to recognize about the Tunisia case is that a variety of different types of healthcare professionals were involved with the national planning program, family planning program from its outset. So although the champion of that program was Tunisia's first female physician, there was actually quite a strong physician shortage in Tunisia around its time of independence. And so what were the first 4 medical schools were starting to, 2 had existed prior to independence, 2 were created after independence, and a 5th one was created more recently. But because there wasn't the same kind of physician base, the program needed, by necessity, it had to be built around other kinds of healthcare providers. And this created a family planning program where you saw a lot of team efforts from the beginning. I'll also say that Tunisia as a model incorporated traditional midwives into its national family planning program as the nursing and professional midwifery programs were starting to build. And so when abortion became legalized, first it was physician only. That was in 1973. In 1982, the only other law that was actually promulgated around abortion was to allow midwives to be able to provide surgical abortion skills as defined at that time. And so when medication abortion became available, midwives were able seamlessly to be able to integrate that within their practice. And midwives continue to really be the backbone of the National Family Planning Program, so this was incorporated into their standards of care. I think we've learned a lot about the ability of midwives and other professionals to provide abortion care from countries like Tunisia, where there hasn't been political opposition, and we really do see that there's similar outcomes. Midwives are certainly capable of not only providing medication abortion care, but determining when somebody requires care from a specialist and making those kinds of referrals. Unfortunately, there are lots of political environments where that's not the case, despite all of the kind of global evidence. And I will say that often that comes from professional groups of physicians who resist the idea of other healthcare professionals being involved. And so it really means getting physicians to give up some of their own control and cede that control and authority to others. So I'll say that piece of it first. To your second point, there are always going to be sort of folks who have complicated lives for which it can be difficult to detect pregnancy. Adolescent groups are certainly a group that we see this around the world, that adolescents, for a number of different reasons, some of which are around kind of cognitive development, some of them are physiological in terms of knowing their own bodies, some of them are about issues around denial and sort of social environments, may have a harder time detecting pregnancy early and often detect pregnancy later. One of the things that I think is reassuring about the use of mifepristone and misoprostol in its combination package form is that it is unlikely to be harmful if someone takes it later in pregnancy. It's just not likely to work as well. And so what will happen is that they'll take the medications and they won't have the abortion that they wanted. That may then prompt people to seek care at a clinic to be able to get more information. That is quite reassuring, I think, to those of us who think, when we think about gestational age and we think, oh, if this person is beyond what we've talked about in our gestational age limits, what will happen? And what's most likely to happen is it's not going to be an effective process for them. Not that they're going to have a dangerous or severe adverse event outcome.
So I have two things in that. I was trying to understand more political part, which I found some, but wanted to know more once your book comes. Because science and technology, it's and continue to advanced, but sometimes political situation sometimes goes to regress, to go backward in certain countries, and definitely situation of India is somehow towards that today. So science and technology, yes, you move, it is benefiting, but sometimes very strong religious, political, apprehensions and as well as barriers. How do you, you have shown that some example, it has been well dead, but sometimes they have much more repercussions in that sense. And I also do agree that de-learning of medical people or so forth, or you can say that changing whole discourse or whole syllabi of these medical students. They need to have study the rights, ethics, choice, all those in their medical course, not only medical technology or medical medicine. This is my perceptions that old school of medical fellow should include that into it in a country like India, because service provider is one of the barriers in which we found in our study, and Professor Sreen knows that we had a paper on that this is one of the major issue, particularly in those areas which are backward, because the reason is that which are better states, the women are much more aware, but they do not want to take, even which is legal, they do not want to take risk either to themselves or to their clinic because of those day-to-day hassle from the local government or authorities. So that I think need to change at medical college level. This is my understanding. The other thing is that pharmacy things, like in India kind of situation and culture, women do not go to the pharmacist. Specifically in again I will say disadvantaged areas. It's like either partner or husband goes to fetch that. Now how do this knowledge reach to them is an again challenge. So one is of course mobile accessibility is increasing, but would that any other whether local health worker or any other provisions can be made so that knowledge reach to them how these pills can be used, or where, when can be used, or how they can become more efficient, effective, in which period. All those is a challenge. Even if you do at pharmacist level intervention, it's not that easy. Even in the person, because as you know that here people go and just buy it because in a different mental state that time. So that is my second. And third is basically, which I would say that now in India there's an example, if you see ECP, emergency contraceptive pill, it was rampantly used, and then certain state banned it, that now you no more can purchase it over the counter, and it has like Maharashtra is one of the example. So many states have taken that, because so sometimes we need to, I think we need to, finding of our research or recommendation should be in such a way that they should not have repercussion on the whole environment, because sometimes that people are there's a much stronger which are opposing this choice rather than those. So they may misinterpret those, kind of findings or those kind of suggestion and recommendations. And that's a tricky business. That's not so simple to. That's, I mean, just you need not to comment that, but I hope that these are all very important in Indian context. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think your points are all excellent. I can't agree with you more in terms of the need for better education in medical schools, and I think that's something we see throughout the world. We have a history in medicine of physician hierarchies that continue to encumber team-based care, and we need to do things to dismantle that. It starts at how it is that we train medical students. And I think that's something that we need to do really needs to happen in medical schools all throughout the world. I think we've learned a lot about what it takes to demedicalize something from the emergency contraception experience, and I do a lot of work around emergency contraception as well. And one of the biggest barriers to removing the prescription requirement for emergency contraception in many countries were physician groups that did not want to cede authority to pharmacists, either to allow pharmacists to provide direct access, meaning that there was some kind of consultation, or to move progestin-only emergency contraception pills over the counter. And so we've learned a lot from that experience, and I think we need to kind of lean into that and say, all right, what did we learn? How is it that we need to work with pharmacists, to train pharmacists, work with physicians so that they can see how this can be done in conjunction, and what are those kinds of politics? I'm not saying my vision is easy by any means, and believe me, as somebody who's an American, I know that this is not an easy path. But I think that we need to have a vision on where we can go for really revolutionizing access to abortion, and we work toward it knowing that we have to take advantage of windows of political opportunity, and sometimes we may need to make our asks more modest because of the political moment that we're in.
Thank you, Professor Foster, for such an illuminating talk. My question is not about the pill, but more about abortion politics, as Professor Chandrasekhar was saying. Abortion is also a philosophical debate as much as it is a medical issue. So, and sometimes the listing out the medical benefits of abortion is not enough to convince a large group of people who talk about the personhood of the fetus and whatnot. So, and one of the arguments women or activists often use is that this body is mine and I have complete authority over my body. But this has also been contested philosophically, be it the rule of first ownership or rule of first occupancy or whatever. So is the claim that this body is mine, is it enough to demand abortion in every situation, or should we be looking for something more concrete? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think abortion is something that can be framed in a lot of different ways. It is a public health and a medical issue. It's a women's rights and human rights issue. It's a social justice issue. It can also be a religious and sociocultural issue. There's a lot of different dimensions to this. I think the most important thing about how we frame abortion access is that we make sure that one frame that we use doesn't undermine other frames. So if we're talking about abortion as a public health issue, we need to do that in a way that doesn't undermine the autonomy and human rights frame. If we're talking about human rights, if we're talking about a human rights frame for abortion, then we need to do that in a way that doesnn't undermine the public health frame on that as well. And I think that's sometimes where we've gotten into some difficulties, even within the sort of abortion advocacy space, where you end up having kind of public health and those who are in that human rights, social justice frame sort of butting heads and using not consistent language and kind of undercutting each other rather than saying, actually, all of these things can be true at the same time. I think, but I also don't think that the autonomy frame is sufficient. And I think we've seen that around the world. That has worked in some contexts. In some contexts, the human rights framework has worked really well. In other contexts, it's a public health framework. We see in countries, particularly countries in the Muslim Middle East and North Africa, that there's actually a very different kind of religious tradition that actually surrounds, particularly with Sunni Islam and early Islamic jurisprudence, that supports abortion as a moral good, but that's actually framed not around individual rights or women's rights. It's much more about issues of community and family health and stability. There are different frameworks that we can use for this. And I think We need to know the context to see which of those are going to be the most powerful messages that we're sending, and that may change over time.
Any other question? Yeah, please.
I too have two questions. One is about the Poland example you have talked of much. And people are purchasing on web-based online, using web-based online. Whether on the web-based online, side effects are also given. Basically, people who are using it, if they have severe side effect, where they will go and what they will tell to the physicians, because abortion is not legal in this thing. The second one is always there is a pharmaceutical companies who are producing pills, who are producing IUD or all other things, all contraceptives. What will be the conflict of interest of them and with this, and whether they will allow it. Or similarly, if government have a very strong contraceptive programs and they are promoting it, and whether it will be in their agenda to include these pills. What is your opinion?
Great question. So first on the thinking about kind of what happens with these demedicalized strategies. Even in countries where abortion is legally restricted, post-abortion care is legal, and it is an ethical and moral obligation of physicians and health services to provide post-abortion care. And so if someone induces an abortion with pills and then needs some kind of follow-up care, everywhere in the world that person is entitled to get that follow-up care in a hospital or clinic. And in the vast majority of countries, there is very little legal exposure, criminal legal exposure to the pregnant person. What we do advise people in heavily restricted legal environments is that they don't have to tell their provider that they took pills and that's why they have their bleeding. They can simply show up at a hospital and say, I'm having vaginal bleeding and cramping, I think I'm having a miscarriage. And therefore they decrease the possibility that that provider is going to contact authorities or report them in some way. So there is some strategic thinking that can go into how it is that people present if they need additional care. But I will say in Brazil for a long period of time, before these telemedicine services started, there were community groups where what they would do is encourage women to take a couple of misoprostol pills. This is before we sort of knew what regimen worked, and then go to the hospital so that they could get post-abortion care because they would definitionally have an open cervix and a little bit of bleeding even though they hadn't had an abortion, and that's really, then they were getting a clinical intervention and being able to get safe and supported care. So I think that is a really important piece of this, that people are still entitled to get this care. There are plenty of places, though, where health facilities may not be as available, and we need to kind of take that into consideration. However, these are the same places where, so then we need to think about what happens when people have miscarriages. Where do they go? Where do they get that kind of care? And think through those kinds of options. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second question that you asked. If you could just give me a little reminder. It was just, there was a lot.
It is between contraceptive, this thing.
Yeah, with the issues of about pharmaceutical companies, and I think this is it's a really interesting question about the role of pharmaceutical companies in the abortion space, which I think is a little bit different than what we've seen in the contraceptive space. And part of that is that because abortion pills have been so politicized, there has actually had to be a lot of collaboration with pharmaceutical companies in much of the world. India is very much an exception, which I'll talk about in a minute, to actually even get this drug produced, right? So advocates have had to actually work with pharmaceutical companies. There have to be, new companies have had to be formed that are only dedicated to medication abortion drugs in order to be able to get this drug out because of the politics. Now, India is a very different context, and we know that there are a lot of different types of mifepristone and medication abortion drugs branded that are being manufactured and distributed in India. Actually, I will say that both Women Help Women and Women on Web, which is another global telemedicine service, both of those, it's pharmacists in India that are sending medication abortion drugs in the mail to people in Poland, right? The drug is, it's like a physician in the Netherlands is reviewing a prescription, contacting a pharmacist or a distributor in India that's DHLing a package of drugs to a woman in Poland. I mean, it is a very kind of global enterprise. And so I think we have to think about the relationship with pharmaceutical companies, but I do think that this space has a somewhat different history than what we've seen with other kind of pharmaceutical development because it's so politicized and it's been so fraught.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah, last one. Pass on the mic.
Thank you so much, Angel. It's always a joy to listen to you. I have one question about the demedicalized strategies, about OTC dispensing. Have any countries adopted that regulatory framework, or do you see some of them moving towards that?
So there are no countries that I know of that actually have an actual regulatory framework for over-the-counter status of medication abortion drugs. We do know that people, and the OTC framework is complicated because about half of the countries in the world don't really have OTC, over-the-counter drugs at all. Like all drugs are held behind the counter, and so at least some interaction with a pharmacist is required. It doesn't have to be a screening or anything, but you still can't just like go and pick it off the shelf like you can a box of Kleenex. It just doesn't work that way in a lot of countries. We do know, though, that misoprostol in particular is often readily available directly from pharmacists without a prescription, much more so than mifepristone and misoprostol, even though it still isn't truly OTC. So we don't really have any models for that now. I actually have some concerns about over-the-counter access if that's the only strategy, and that has to do with the cost. And so part of the reason in Canada we're working toward a behind-the-counter model is that mifepristone in Canada costs about 300 Canadian dollars, so it's about 250 US dollars. It's an expensive drug. It's covered through provincial and territorial health insurance schemes, so it's free of charge to the pregnant person. If it was to go over the counter, people would have to pay out of pocket for that drug. There's just not a system in Canada, and that's true in most places. Once something goes over the counter, it's no longer covered by in most places, it's no longer covered through health insurance schemes or drug coverage benefits. And so I think we really have to look at that. And again, we learned a lot from the EC, from the emergency contraception space about this, that emergency contraception, when it became over the counter in a lot of places, became so expensive that it was hard for people to be able to afford it. And so I think we need to be judicious about it. That doesn't mean you can't explore creative strategies of mixed status drugs or be able to have both a BTC and an OTC option, but I think we really need to look at that as we move out. And finally, and you had said this before about men going to pharmacies, I will just say as a shout out to Depeche, the study that they did in Delhi actually had two mystery client profiles. One as they were a mystery client couple where the woman and the man both visited the same pharmacy several days apart, and both were actually able to obtain mifepristone and misoprostol. Although it seems that the male client actually got more information from pharmacists with the assumption that, he wouldn't know but would need to tell his partner about how to use the drugs in a way that maybe the woman client didn't. And so I think that's a really interesting issue to explore more.
Okay, thank you. That has been quite exciting to really listen to the various aspects of the abortion politics and say, I think it's really an issue which needs really more investigation, more research, and also the larger changes in the world. Now I understand that even demedicalization is not fully possible if it is not completely depending on the pharmacist. Naturally, it's also difficult to have a complete demedicalization in this case. Okay, thank you so much for all these insights.